So you go by Mexican Myths and Folklore on X, formerly known as Twitter, and
Yeah.
you are considered just a historian for the Mexican myths, basically, right?
Well, my main route of studies is accountancy, but I like to collect a lot of books and information about the Mexican myths and folklore because I think it's a subject very little studied. It's a theme that little people study and express in social media because I sense that one of the things that happen with the Mexican diaspora in the United States is that they are people that trying to find its roots about in fiction and everything, but at the same time, the diaspora lacks the resources or the information of their origin of their communities about certain topics. I always want to express because I think that there is a lot of misinformation about certain cultural Mexican topics, and obviously, sadly, a lot of platforms in the internet, especially in X, because one of the things I have like a hate and love relation with X because with X we can express everything, but sadly there is another or right wing people that it's co-opting these spaces and usually they are making their own stuff about the things they doesn't understand as a whole, especially about the pre-Hispanic past, the New Spain period, Mexican independence, and usually there are things that I want to express my opinion and obviously giving resources about these topics because I think that misinformation is very dangerous in these times.
I agree with you. Misinformation is a very dangerous thing, especially in these times when so many people speak about how they want the true information and how they really want to know about our past, and yet they don't share it correctly. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very honored to have you here today because I don't really know about too much of Mexican myths except for
Mhm.
the Aztecs, Mayans, or I'm talking about the Americas in a whole at least. And it's just interesting to know that in the Americas, there's a whole range of different myths out there. In Mexico, that's one of the first places I actually want to visit. I don't care about going to Egypt or go back to Tepe. I've always been fascinated with Mexico. Um, and it's the reason why is because the culture seems so uh, like a melting pot, like you said earlier. Like there's a mixture of everything going on. Just like when you talked about, you said you live near a volcano, and then you was talking about, you said black population, and then you said, the Chinese population, and so on and so forth. So let me ask you, the indigenous people of Mexico, what do you consider the indigenous people of Mexico?
Well, the indigenous people of Mexico, you need to understand that the political, well, that the Mexican state, when it's making their consensus about how much of the indigenous population exists in the country, they consider two things. One, you need to speak an indigenous language to be considered an indigenous person, and the second, you need to live near to an indigenous area to be considered indigenous. The one of the things that happens a lot in Mexico is that a lot of the population, a huge bunch of the population descend from indigenous people directly. But the issue is when these populations migrate to the cities, they lost their identity and their language because in the past century there was a very aggressive politics about teaching Spanish to everyone. They wanted to be the lingua franca from Mexico, and a lot of these
Mm.
indigenous languages tend to disappear because these policies. That is there's some kind of conflict in the identity because a lot of people who live in the cities are from indigenous backgrounds, but at the same time these people doesn't remember very well their communities of the region, about the language they speak, and the discrimination, and that creates some kind of division between the because there is the cultural mestizo. The cultural mestizo, it's everyone: the whites, the mixed, the indigenous descendants, and the indigenous who live in their communities. And there's some kind of a wall between them that obviously make very difficult to understand the necessities of each community in the urban areas and the rural areas. For example, I live in Toluca. Toluca is some kind of the middle between an urban area and a rural area. And you can find in the city, for example, some people who speak Ñañú, some who speak Masawa, Ñacto, and there are even in my city we can count like four different indigenous groups, and with the Spaniards and with the mixed, and obviously there is a conflict of trying to recover the identity of the people who lost their identity because of the Mexican policy integration. But I consider that indigenous people, obviously, you need to live in a community and have your and speak a language to be considered fully indigenous in the Mexican mindset.
Right, right, right. That's interesting because to me, understanding the myths is I have to go to the text, the ancient text itself. And I'm sure you heard shows like from History Channel and stuff about they talk about ancient aliens and stuff like that, and they talk about where these gods come from. When it comes to these mythologies and these myths, or at least from what you understand, where do you think these gods come from, or do you believe that they were talking about gods from somewhere else, or were they talking about indigenous people that were learning how to manipulate their land to better their people?
Well, when we speak about the indigenous myths, especially, you need to understand as a topic, there is different areas, cultural areas of influence in Mexico. For example,
Mm.
the north of Mexico is very different to the center and very different to the south. There are like three regions who are very different in their context and with their indigenous groups. For example, I live in the center. Obviously, it was a central area between native empires like the Toltecs, like the Tepanecs, like the Mexica, and like the Purepecha. And these people have their own myths. Obviously, so they share some similarities, but it's very different into the south and it's very different to the north. And they and obviously and these people tend to have a different variety of mix of myths and stories. And obviously there is a misconception about certain things, because I always say that a lot of the ancient astronauts and aliens, it's some kind of misinformation that ironically derived from Pulp Fiction. How can I tell you? Because
Mhm.
when you read the Pulp Fiction, it's you can see the Serpent Man, the ancient UFO civilization, and they make the jump of fiction to make these things happen in reality, but it's not the case, because when they see the Mayan disappear, no, they didn't disappear. These Mayan people still exist. They exist. Obviously, their great cities of their classic period crumble, but their culture still exists. And obviously, when some people say no, the Mayan disappears, and when the Spaniards came, they doesn't consider nothing. No, they were still living in the Yucatecs, in Guatemala, and these people exist, and they still exist. They have their own myths, they have their own traditions, and it's a very complex mindset these peoples have. For example, from the Maya, we can encounter influence from the central Mexico, and it's a misconception about everything, because sadly, the Mexican academics of history and anthropology, they tend to be very how can I explain the meaning of the word? They are not so open to express to debunk this misinformation. They tend to center only in their text, in their conferences between them. But sadly, the population doesn't reach this kind of information. For example, myself, I went to some conference with historians, and sadly, there are like five or three people attending their speechings and everything, and the people doesn't learn about them, because they doesn't have the ability to spread its knowledge in the internet. And sadly, that's a lot of white supremacists. Some is Spanish Empire, who is the fans tends to rewrite everything. For example, one of
Mhm.
the stuff I always made annoying is this: they say no, the Aztecs, the pre-Hispanic people were cannibals. They were eating each other, and I say no, no, no. The cannibals exist, but It was a very specific ritual, and not everyone was eating people. But they
Right.
say, no, 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 no. They were eating everyone. And if the Spaniards didn't come, you will still eating people. I say, no, not everyone was eating people. It's a thing that it was debunked in the past century, but the theme is coming again and again and again, and they are using the movie of Apocalypto like some kind. Look, they were savage and everything. I say no, 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 no. It's fiction. It's a movie. You can learn from real people if you are using a movie, and obviously a
Right.
movie who has a lot of liberties, a lot of misconception about how the Mayan warfare works. But the people say no, 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 no. This is the reality, and I say no. It's fiction. You can use fiction to describe a real people that still sticks and face discrimination.
Right, right. Yeah, that's very interesting you bring that up because a lot of people seem to say that, the myths back then portray them as being savages and so on and so forth, and they were eating people and they were sacrificing children and so on and so forth. And when I've read some ancient texts from, down there and stuff like that, and I can tell you when I read these books from certain individuals, I can definitely tell that they're coming from a narrative that they don't really understand because they don't know about the culture, they don't know about the people down there, they don't know about the stories and so on and so forth. Um, I remember watching the movie 300. I'm not sure if you ever seen that movie 300 with the
300.
Spartans and stuff. Yeah, yeah. In the beginning, they showed where the babies were deformed and they would sacrifice their babies and stuff like that if they weren't because they weren't up to par for the Spartans and so on and so forth. And it's just interesting to me because at that time nobody was saying that these people were savages, that that's how they maintained their supremacy over others and strength and so on and so forth. What is the best source for somebody to read about Mexican myths? Like, what is your favorite source that you have about that?
Well, specifically, there are two Spaniard friars. I always recommend always is Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. History of the New Spain is obviously it's like the core book to understand as a whole the mythological mindset of the peoples of Mesoamerica, especially about the Aztec or Mexica people. And the other one it's Jacinto de la Serna, who was a Spanish friar from this area that study a lot of the myths and rituals and superstition that indigenous people have. But there is a lot of sources. But I think that these two are the more vital because these guys, especially the first one, Fray Bernardino, was part of the Inquisition, and his duty was to learn everything from these people to try to destroy the indigenous
Mhm,
beliefs because they believe that you need to understand your enemy to destroy your enemy. So this guy studied with the indigenous people, especially who survived the conquest, about the wise men who survived the violence of the conquistadors, and for decades he collected a lot of their memories and the information. But in one
mhm,
point he was his work was banned because in some point of his life Bernardino say that the things that happened in the conquest they were very unfair from the indigenous people, and in some point he said these people were in certain things of politics and even in philosophy are superior to the people of Europe. And in some
mhm,
point he write that my hand is started, and I can't describe what things they were lost forever. And that guy, his work was banned, and centuries later, after the Mexico independence, his work was found and it was published. And Jacinto de la Serna was an inquisitor, but not more tolerant. But it was like in the mindset of Fray Bernardino to correct everything. And really, this guy tried to destroy a lot of the indigenous religions. And in some point, he encountered some kind of cause that mixed the Catholic faith with indigenous faith, and he tried to eradicate these calls and practice, but it totally failed. It wasn't is then And that's why I say these two, Jacinto La Serna and Fernando de Sahagún, are the most vital. I'm Francisco de Duran, Motolinia. Is my four ones. Jacinto La Serna, no, Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, Diego de Duran, y Motolinia are the four ones I recommend
Okay.
to start.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna have to get you to send me the names of
Okay.
those because I definitely want to look at that. I have something right here that I want to bring up that was interesting that you shared a couple of days ago. Actually, can you tell me
Mhm.
more about this right here? What is this a representation of?
Well, I need to explain Mexican indigenous belief that a lot of some certain indigenous group have around Mexico. They consider the ancient statues of the indigenous the pre-Hispanic cultures. They consider this kind of representations. It depends of the community. They consider this in, for example, I'm gonna tell you in the valley of the Mesquita where my mother was born, the indigenous people they knew they call these kind of statues antiguas, the antiguas, the ancient ones, and they consider that these statues they are their ancestors, and they collect these statues and they worship them because they think that these statues are their ancestors and they need to be remember it and they must be worshipped because they bring fortune and luck to their communities. And that's why, for
Mhm.
example, this one is from Guerrero. It's on Tasmalac, Guerrero, and it's a Aztec statue. And they consider this kind of statue like the lords of the mountains because in the indigenous mindset in Mexico, they consider the mountains like some kind of sacred spaces when you can speak to the gods and ask the favor of the rain and fertility. And when they encounter these statues, they consider, it's one of their ancestors. We must bring them back. Obviously, I am telling you of a phenomenon that it was very hidden in the New Spain period because obviously if the Spanish friars find that some indigenous they were worshiping these kind of statues, they tend to destroy it. So they tend to hidden in certain areas, but when the Mexican independence happened and in the past century, there was a lack, there is a lack, more tolerance to these kind of practices. And
Mhm.
obviously the communities had the opportunity of not hiding anymore these kind of statues and they tend to worship them. For example, this is one of the Taj Mahal. There is another ones who from the area of Tehuantepec who worship them to bring for the women to be fruitful with children, fertility for the land. But there are certain figures that they were considered like with misfortune and they tend to destroy it. Obviously, it depends in the community and in a concilium they made between the members of saying this statue is good, this statue is bad, we need to
Mhm.
keep it here, we must leave it. So it depends on the indigenous community mostly.
That's interesting because when you said the mountain gods, that's very interesting to me because of the simple fact that when it's when I read like the Bible or the Sumerian text or the text from Egypt or something like that, or even the Greek text, usually their gods are on higher ground. Like something like Mount Olympus, basically, right? They're on higher ground, and technically they have what they call angels, which is technically messengers, which would come from the top of the mountains down to the bottom to the people to send messages, and then take messages from the people to send back to their gods on top of the mountains. And that's very interesting to me because of the simple fact that it seems like across the whole wide world we have these gods, I guess you can say, in so many different ways. uh, they're on higher ground, and usually to describe that in the most lamest terms, I guess you can say, is that they're sky gods because they're higher up in the sky than down below. Do you agree with that, or is that something that you would like to clarify
Mm,
on?
well, I need to explain something. The
Okay.
conception of the mountain lords is because in the Mesoamerican myths, the mountains are considered the barn of the gods because they consider that inside the mountains they were like some kind of seeds like corn, like beans, and obviously they consider the mountains some kind of divine barns that the people always must ask to the mountain, please share share your treasures with the people. So the mountains were worshipped like some kind of divine barns that they must be feeded with sacrifice, with offerings to that the earth release these gifts to the communities. And notice there's some kind of guardians that protect these mountains. And I believe the people always ask favors from them. For example, some people the community go and pray in certain caves, and because they believe that these caves are the entrance to these sacred barns, and in these barns they believe that there is some kind of guardians that keep this treasure, and they give this treasure to this community with offerings. About the myths about the lords of the mountains. There are certain myths. For example, in the Nyanu people, they believe that after the rise of man, there was another kind of people named the Wemas. The Wemas, they were giants. They were huge
Mhm.
giants that once ruled the earth. And when humans appear, they teach to the people, they teach the arts of civilization, and the Wemas died in a great war, and their corpses are the mountains. And obviously, they transform in stone because of this great war. And in the Aztec myths, there is the Tequinametzin, the first people that appears in the first sun, that they were destroyed by giant jaguars by the gods Tezcatlipoca. So that's I understand why there is a common misconception, because there are certain myths that they are pretty catchy with the theories of the ancient astronauts and everything. But I sense that these kind of myths have another meanings about the people after you, they were in in balance with nature, and you need to be grateful with nature. That is a lot of worship with nature in the indigenous communities, and sadly, that is the collide with the Mexican politics of the neoliberal order, because when they are making roads, when they are making fabrics, obviously it's a very violent form to with the environment, and a lot of indigenous communities, they tend to respect nature, and sadly the
Mhm.
fabrics, the industries tend to contaminate a lot of the natural environment, and that's is the confrontation with the indigenous communities and the current factories, and obviously that make a lot of the drug war we are living in certain areas of Mexico. Because in some point, for example, I want to tell you something: the Canadian miners tend to use mercenaries or even the cartels to attack the communities of indigenous communities, to displace them and steal their land, and obviously mine with fracking and contaminate everything, and leaving the people in poverty, and making them to migrate to the urban areas. Mhm.
That's very interesting. So my next question has to do with, what do you consider Mexican myths? Because there was a time when the borders of Mexico wasn't where it's at right now. We know that it wasn't, just that location. So what like what do you consider the Mexican myths, and how far do you think it went? Like, do you think it went, you know, all the way up to California, down to, South America, or did the border, because the borders obviously shrank a little bit, right? We know that, but
Well, I think that the Mexican meat cycle obviously have a lot of boundaries between the cultural area of Mesoamerica and the Spaniard expansion in the southwest of the United States. But one of the things that there is a figure, a very central figure that appears in many myths in many myths in Mexico and beyond the Mexican borders. And one in this figure is Moctezuma. Moctezuma, for
mm,
certain is the Native American group, is some kind of a king god, or some kind of civilization bringer that was killed by the Spaniards, and there was some kind of myths between the Pueblo, the Opata people who are from the north of Mexico, and they believe this kind of great king one day will return to restore the balance who was destroyed by the Spaniards. And in the south and central Mexico, there is a lot of myths relating Moctezuma, because in some communities they believe Moctezuma is some kind of powerful spirit that have influence in the underworld, and other indigenous communities see Moctezuma as some kind of evil spirit because the echoes of this figure still lives in the memories of the in the indigenous communities in Mexico, even beyond the central the central area of influence of the Aztec Empire. You can encounter myths of Moctezuma among the Maya and beyond
Right, right.
Salvador, Nicaragua, and obviously this part, for example, Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, they share a lot of the Mexican and some kind of the Mexican primordial myths because in some point there was communities of Nahua descendant people who came with the
Mhm.
conquistadors, and in some point there was some kind of interaction between the New Spain, and they share some figures like La Llorona, the Wailer, the Cadejo, the dwarves like Chaneques. So there is a lot of cultural area influence that it's very difficult in some point to talk in one session because you need to understand that a lot of these ideas they tend to migrate with commerce and when the New Spain with the Silver Road.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering that because I know a lot of people like to say combine it all the mythologies into one basically. Do you consider the Popol Vuh part of the Mexican myths but just in a different name?
I consider well in my experience, I consider the Mayan people. They have certain stuff who we can share with the center, south, and northern Mexico. But at the same time, the Mayan they are a different world
Mhm.
because the Mayan people are have a very concentrated group of people with a different mindset, and in some point, yeah, a lot of people doesn't know the Mayans make literally a racial war against the mixed population and the Spaniard descendant people in some point of their history because when Mexican independence happened, the Yucatan Peninsula wanted to make independence from Mexico, but at the same time they were waging a genocidal war between the Mayan people because the Mayan wanted to literally a racial war between the mixed population. And in some point, the Yucatan administration asked help from the United States to help them to repel the rebels. But in the end, the Mexican forces forced the Mayans to integrate to the Mexican territory, and in some point the Mayans have some kind of distrust with some kind of the and with other Mexicans because they are a very proud people that obviously they consider their own people, their own myths. But I consider Popol Vuh some kind of the part of the original myths because you can
Right.
find certain similarities between the destruction of the sons of the ages in the Popol Vuh. You can find certain figures of the gods of the dead, or the confrontation between the gods of light who bring the corn between the gods of the dead. You can encounter this kind of confrontation in the Aztecs
Mhm.
and myths. So I consider part of the corpus of the Mexican myths, but at the same time, I know that the Mayan people as a whole they have or difference with the Mexicans, and they tend to express, no, I am from the Yucatan, I am Yucatec, I am Mayan, and then I am Yucatec or Mayan, and second I am Mexican. So they are very proud people of their own history.
That's I really appreciate you clarifying that for me because it seems like a lot of times, like I said, a lot of people just like to throw it all in one pile and just say this is it, what it is, and they don't understand that there's different cultures and different beliefs and so on and so forth. Even through Christianity, there's different beliefs within Christianity. Yes, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament, but the beliefs within those testaments alone are different for everybody. That's why everybody represents Christianity in their own way. Let me ask you: Are do you follow a religious sect? Like, are you Christian or Catholic?
Yeah, I born as a Catholic,
Mm.
because of my family. They are all Catholics, but at the same time, it's one of the things that I always have some kind of arguing between the trad cats in Twitter and obviously this kind of hardcore Catholics that they tend to teach that who is the true religion. But one of the things you need to understand about Mexican Catholicism is that in the rural areas that I come from, because my mother was from a very rural area with an indigenous stratum, even if she was indigenous as a whole, because my mother was, we call it here in the case system, castiza, was a castiza. But this is the when you grow in a rural area, you tend to understand that it's the Catholic system of the church and the folklore customs that the people have around religion. For example, you can be a very good Catholic going to the mass and everything, but at the same time you have the belief in spirits, in some kind of amulet, in the ritual you need to make to that bring fortune or bring good harvest, because the Mexican Catholicism has some kind of balance between the pagan beliefs and the European beliefs. And that is a stuff that many people, it's very hard to understand that that the Mexicans, yeah, they are Catholic, but at the same time they have certain beliefs that they root behind in the pre-Hispanic area. For example, in the rural area, they tend to dance and make offerings to the earth and ask favor to certain spirits that they are in some kind of balance or with the Christian God like Jesus Christ, for example. In the Valley of the Mesquita, they consider Jesus Christ with the sun. They consider that it's the son of the God of the sun God,
Mhm.
and they make an offerings and they consider that Jesus was some kind of a civilization God that brings fortune to the people, and there was fighting the demons, and there is a lot of mixing of beliefs,
Mhm.
and usually in the urban areas, obviously the Catholic dogma, also in the form of the European way, is more stronger. But if you go outside the cities, you can find a lot of folklore beliefs surrounding God, surrounding the spirits, surrounding certain persons. For example, the ancestor worship. Even one of the most polemic things that happen is that you can find in certain areas of Mexico, even in recent times, evidence of human sacrifice that happened in very recent years, and that is a reality. It's some kind of urban legend. Obviously,
Right.
there is no official record, but obviously, it's the kind of stuff that some kind of urban legend that happens. Obviously, there is certain is the academic investigation about the subject, but obviously it's very difficult because the community doesn't speak of these things with strangers.
Right.
And
Right.
obviously there are the things that doesn't want to speak with someone outside. They only have rumors, and obviously there is an area in central Mexico. It's called Mount Tlaloc. Mount Tlaloc, it's a mountain who was the place of worshiping of the god Rain of Tlaloc. And Joseph Barlow, who was a friend of H.P. Lovecraft, who was an anthropologist, made
Mhm.
investigation in that area and found that in that area they were making sacrifice very recent, and the people, they were very worried about the information about the practice. So
That's
it's
interesting.
yeah, very
And
interesting.
that's very interesting because my next question was going to ask you about. Can you tell me about the Happy Candlemas Day? I guess you have that. I'm gonna bring it up real quick.
Mhm.
You posted about it, uh, and you had a little plate of food and stuff like that. This right here. But
Ah,
you,
so
yeah.
it's mole with rice and egg and with a tortilla. Obviously,
Mm,
in two of February, in
mhm,
Mexico, we have this custom about when we have in it started in 6th of January. In 6th of January, we have this kind of bread of Hispanic origin called rosca, and in this kind of bread there is some kind of figurine of baby Jesus, and where you are cutting this bread and sharing with your family, if this figurine appears in your bread you are eating, you have the obligation to make some a food in Candlemas Day in 2 of February. For example, I get the figurine, so I make tamales and I share it my family and some relatives and some neighbors in my colony, and they make huge parties about because it's the presentation of baby Jesus in the temple in the Candlemas Day. So but at the same time, this tradition in certain areas of Mexico have an indigenous background because in that time there was the starting of the ceremonies to the rain god to bring fertility to the land, and they use the tamales like an offering food. And obviously, in 2 of February, the special food that everyone makes is tamales. So it's a connection with these festivities that were in the past and with the Christian ones.
Right
So,
on, right on. So I've been going through your posts a lot. I like to learn about what people share. Of course, I ask for podcast discussions and stuff like that. Can you explain? Let me bring this up real quick. I would like for you to explain this right here. What is this right here?
well, it's a fragment. Wait me a second. Perhaps I have this book. But, no, no, no. It's from a book I always like to explain about the indigenous paper, and obviously is one of a topic I was speaking to you early about how the indigenous people see Moctezuma, and obviously the
Mm,
Otomi people see Moctezuma as some kind of a tyrant, and especially in the indigenous mindset, they see Moctezuma as some kind of evil spirit because Moctezuma, when he was ruling the Aztec Empire, waged war against the indigenous people. Obviously, the Ñañu are the most ancient people of Mesoamerica, and in their collective memory, Moctezuma transformed itself in some kind of evil spirit, and they must tame him and use him against his own enemies. And obviously, one
mm,
of the things that is very honest that a lot of people doesn't know is this kind of sorcery. That you can see, they use these kinds of figurines of paper that represent the spirits, that represent the concepts of nature they want to tame and control. For example, like these ones.
wow.
And obviously, it's a very unknown subject because a lot of people beyond their communities doesn't know about these things. And obviously,
Mm,
it's one of my main obsessions to expose to the people because there are things that mostly people doesn't understand about our culture, and they tend to speak of subjects that they doesn't understand as a whole.
right, right,
And,
right.
and at the same time, perhaps I started this project because I like to read comics and books and everything. And I
Mhm.
always see that the Mexicans in the United States, they tend to use the most cliche stuff about the luchadores, Day of the Dead. And at the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
time,
Day of the Dead. That's the one. That's what most people know about. Just basic television and movies is the dawn of as the Day of the Dead. Yeah.
exactly. And I believe there is a lot of stuff that you can use in your fiction. and as,
Yeah.
and obviously I said like only I like the Day of the Dead. For example, in my city, there is the fair of Alfeñique. It's a huge fair about Mexican traditional candy, and the main square of my city there is a lot of shops of candy and everything. That's the one's one.
Yep.
El papel, yeah, obviously that's the one. I don't have it right now in my hands, but that is the book. It's about the use of paper, because one of the things that in Mexico survives is the use of traditional paper, because a lot of people when they speak about the indigenous past, they didn't know that in Mexico we had books, we had libraries, huge libraries that they were born in the by the conquistadors, and
Mm.
obviously the memory was erased from a lot of our history. And the people say, "Ah, you didn't have books." And say, "No, we have books. We had paper. We invented paper. We had books." And sadly, the only thing that survived there was the fabrication of paper. And obviously, some entire communities had this kind of sorcery using figuring papers. I always have some kind of similarities between the Japanese the seals with, and but I see that the Mexican ones are more prettier. But yeah.
Let me ask you, why do you think it's different colors? Why is it different colors? Like, why is it the yellow color? What does yellow represent?
The colors depends a lot of the things you wanted to make with this kind of figures. The black ones are for black magic. The white ones are for asking for obviously white magic to helping people to improve their health. And the color ones represent, for example, the yellow one represents the sun. The red one represents blood. The green ones represent nature, and they use these figurines in certain rituals to ask favor for this kind of entity. Because, for example, these figurines represent some kind of a spirit and entity they want to ask a favor. For example, this kind, for example, is the siren. It's a siren because you can see the tail. It's an
Mhm.
entity of water. So they use these
An
figurines when
entity
they
of
ask
water.
exactly.
What was go expand on that? What do you mean entity of water? Like they came from the depths of the sea? They came from water, or
They come from the rivers
oh, river?
and springs. So and his name is Enmute. Enmute is the name of this entity, and they consider this kind of spirit that guards the waters. And you need to ask favor to this kind of entity. You want to ask, you go to a spring, you need to ask to these entities that I want water, and you can take water from certain places because these spirits protect the waters, protect the mountains, protect the roads. And I believe this is from the Nyuhu people, and it's a branch of the Otomi people, and they are the ones who preserve most of this tradition because in some point these people make a rebellion against the New Spain because they wanted to restore the indigenous way of life, and at some point they suffer a great repression, but their beliefs resisted to these days.
Hmm. Man, that is so interesting to me because it seems like there are deities, gods, or whatever people would like to call them. That some of it has to do with the mountains, and some of it has to do with inner waters of some sort, whether it's the water of the seas, rivers, lakes, ponds, or whatever the case may be. And was that God? Did that God teach humanity anything? Do you know of? Does it say it?
Well, mostly in the Mexican myths, there was the giants. There's a lot of civilizational heroes. Obviously, the most famous one are the giant ones. For example, in the
Mhm.
for the Aztecs, there were the Kinametsin, who are the giants of the first sun, who are the ones who had the knowledge, and they were destroyed by the gods. In the new people, they were the Wemas, who teach the people all kind of stuff, but at the same time they were destroyed in a great war. In certain in the region of Puebla, there is this giant called Shelhua. Shelhua was a giant who survived the universal let me a second to know this the in a second because I mean my English is not very well.
No, I understand you well. I understand you very well, to be honest with
Well,
you.
the universal well,
Mhm.
Shelka was a giant who survived the universal flood, and when he survived, and when the flood came down, he came to teach humanity. Obviously, the civilizational heroes they tend to be giants, and the water entities they tend to be more like guardians of nature, and you need
Okay.
to ask them favors. But at the same time, you can find stories. This is a very a very interesting story that I usually tend to use in fiction because in certain, for example, in the city I came from, there are certain little hills and mountains, and there is the belief that inside these mountains they are cities inhabited by certain creatures like some kind of gnomes and dwarves, and in some point these kind of gnomes and dwarves ask some kind of favor from the people. Whereas, for example, when someone is making a road and it must pass between the mountains, the engineers must they need to make a sacrifice to
Mhm.
ask the favor to these entities to let them pass to make the construction. And obviously, one of the things that these entities tend to ask, obviously, I am talking in the sense of urban legend and folklore, they tend to ask about human lives because
Mhm.
these entities ask for slaves to work in their cornfields is the underground. And obviously, there is some kind of funny, well, an urban legend that if you are working in the construction area, you need to be very worried because there are people they tend to disappear, and they offering them to these kind of entities to let them pass in their territories.
Hmm. Right, right. So you have a lot of interesting stuff on your page. What is this right here? And before you question, or answer the question, I study a lot of myths from around the world. I like to do my comparative studies, trying to see what similarities I can find from different mythologies from around the world. Do you also try in so many ways before you explain what this picture is? Do you try to compare the mythologies from around the world to see how much similarities you can find between different cultures and religions and
There are
places
certain similarities. There are certain similarities. For example, there are certain similarities about Mexico, some Mexican beliefs and narratives between Asia, especially with China. There are certain similarities between certain specific animal roles in mythology, and they tend to have a very similar role with the Chinese ones. It's a
Mhm.
you need one of the things you need to understand about Mexican is the folklore stories. It's a very early this area of study because in some point when the archaeologists anthropologists tend to investigate the Mexican myths, the indigenous people doesn't speak a lot of these things with the strangers. So in a point they believe the Mexican doesn't have any kind of mythology and everything, but the problem is that the indigenous people doesn't speak with someone who is a stranger with their communities. Only when you gain their trust, they share you a certain fragment of the knowledge they have. For example, I have a friend, an indigenous friend, near to in a city near Metepec. This guy he makes clay figurines of musical instruments from clay using pre-Hispanic inspiration and everything. And this guy knows a lot of information. And I always try to ask something, but this guy only share me the things he wants to share me. He doesn't share me everything because in some point, obviously, I am not like I am obviously in American standards I am not white, but in Mexican standards I am not fully indigenous. And this guy, when I saw it, and he speak, it was very polite with me, but he always put some kind of barrier that he can share me everything, the things he knows.
Mhm.
And it's like some kind of sad thing because at some point I want to know, to know,
Right.
to spread, but this guy always keep the things that he knows to himself. And sadly, he will die and he doesn't share nothing.
Mm. And do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? I know, putting the emotions aside, you know what I mean. Do you think that's a good thing and bad thing? Because is that, do you think that's how the myths die, the traditions die, or do you think that they only tell certain people to keep those myths alive?
I think that it's a tragedy because in some point this kind of tradition with kind of knowledge is lost forever. And imagine
Right.
all the long road this information passed from surviving the Inquisition, surviving the Mexican independent wars, surviving everything, even the cartel wars. They are, and in some point when this knowledge is lost, it's lost forever. And I
Right.
know stories about certain practices, about certain persons who knew very specific things about their people, and when they died, this knowledge was lost forever. And I say that it's a tragedy because in Mexico we are having problems with the cartel violence, with poverty, with corruption, and I think that the the traditions, the knowledge of the past can help us to regain force to affront these kind of adversities we are living right now.
Right, right, right. I appreciate that. So tell me about this picture right here.
Oh,
What are we witnessing right here?
well, these masked figures represent the ancestors of the Otomi people, the Shita. In the indigenous communities of Ñañú Stratum, they have these festivals of the Shita ancestors. They believe that the ancestors came in the form of the mask, and when someone uses the mask is possessed by this by the spirit of their ancestors, and they tend to dance and give omens about the things that the community must do to improve its relation with the environment, and to and give and giving advices to the people to be more polite, to be more to work more harder, and say they have these extravagant faces because they represent the old ones, so the elders, and they tend to dance and making a lot of noise, and they tend to dance in around around the communities, asking giving food or receiving food. It's a very huge festival that happens in mostly this is from Alfajayucan in the state of
Mhm.
Hidalgo, but happens in Jilotepec, in the community in Jilotepec, Atlacomulco, and Alfajayucan, and Texmelucan.
You know, I told you before we started that I do want to make my first trip to like a historical place outside of America. I've been to like Iraq and Afghanistan, but that was only when I was in the military, and I got to see some cool stuff out there. But I always wanted to see the Mexican pyramids and stuff like that. So I definitely have to. I'm definitely going to stay in contact with you because I definitely want you to show me around. It's very interesting because when I look at the mask on the right, I believe it's on your right hand side, the one
Mhm.
without the hat on. Um, Comparing that to what the Dogon tribe looks like in Africa, it looks like it's almost similar. And you say that there's a lot of similarities between the Mexican and the Chinese, and that's very interesting to me because I've read a lot of Chinese mythology also, and I know that China and Japan share a lot of similarities too. So obviously that means that all three obviously must share some type of similarity. What is it? Why do you think that is? Like, what is the main reason for the similarities? Do you think it's because of migration, or do you think that the Mexicans had traveled outside of that area and possibly
I
went to
I think
Asia or?
some kind of the archetypical archetypes, sea, primordial archetypes, the Asiatic people, because the indigenous people in Mexico descend from Asiatic population that came from Siberia, and they came with a certain archetypical types of motifs and traditions that obviously it develop in a different way. For example, when you see, for example, the archetype of the dragon, you can see the dragon in Iran, the dragon in China, and usually the Mexican dragon. Also about the Quetzalcoatl. You can see that they have some aesthetic similarities between the Aztec, between the Mexican Quetzalcoatl or plumaged serpent with the Chinese dragon, with the Dinarian dragon, because in some point there are certain similarities. For example, even in Mexico, the swastika exists in the indigenous art in Mexico.
Okay, okay, that's so interesting. So, what persuades you to go ahead and say, "Hey, I want to share, or I want to first learn about more of the Mexican myths and share it to the people"?
Well, mostly because I sense that we are living in the age of globalization of the information, and sadly, there is a lot of content in books and in communities that it doesn't reach so far their community borders. And I think that one of the things that we are living right now as a people and as a global community is that certain discourse of supremacies and misinformation about certain groups of people, they are reaching very powerful people that they are having their own opinion about about the things they doesn't understand. For example, I was looking about the Marco Rubio discourse about the cowboy culture, and there was a lot of people saying, no,
Absolutely.
no, no. And myself, my mother was was a charra. My mother was a charra, and I knew a lot of this kind of word they were talking about. And when they say no, this stuff came from Spain and Spain and I say no, yes, it came from Spain, the base, but the development was far different from the European one, because the charro started in the frontiers of the New Spain against the plain Indians, like the Comanche, like the protection of the livestock and everything. And obviously the charreria was the aspiration of the nobility that was lost in the Mexican independence, was certain pues the white population that existed in Mexico, that they wanted to express with this kind of dressing, that they were some kind of lost nobility of the hacienda system. And I say yes, Spain created that, but you need to understand that this stuff was its development was far different and it's its own thing. Yes, it came from Spain, but it's our own thing. And one of the things I always dislike is when they say, no, everything came from Spain. No, 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 no. Of course it came from Spain, but the Mexicans, the indigenous people, the mestizo, everyone make this stone their own. It's our
Mhm.
own stuff. It's not a thing that it must be grateful for, because I always say, imagine if the Chinese were so egocentric about saying that we give you paper, we give you powder, we give you, and I say, no, the Chinese doesn't give a damn about these things. And there is some kind of discourse about making us feel ashamed, or feel little about our own cultural achievements. And I sense that in some point we need to recover some kind of our collective memory as a people in Mexico, to have a different perspectives on how to deal with the problems we are living. And sadly, the Mexican diaspora, I sense that there are people that it doesn't need to leave this country, because these people leave this land because they wanted to be a better life, and the Mexican politician didn't make the things better for everyone. And these people right now, they are living in the United States, and at the same time, I know that they doesn't feel like belong in the WASP system. And I think, well, why don't share a little of the things I know in English, that a lot of people perhaps read, and someone read it and has some Mexican background and say, "Oh, look, this is the kind of my people do beyond the border," or something like that.
That's interesting because I actually watched that video about
Mhm.
the horses coming to America. Something that I've learned is that there were horses in the Americas long before Cortez came here. They just went extinct, I think, about 10,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000. I can't remember exactly the date, but it was about they went extinct in the Pleistocene. I can't remember what time frame, so I don't want to get the information out there that's incorrect. But there were some type of horses here before that, and then of course Cortez came here and he brought some horses and stuff like that. And it's just very interesting to me because um, I think the way that we word things are very important. Like you just said earlier, your English is not too good, right? And um, that you use the words that you can use to better describe what you know of in the best way that you possibly can. And I think it's important for us all to know that we can all say things, and it might not um, I'm not going to say be inaccurate, but it can be to the point where the wording may not be right. And as long as you talk to the person, like me and you are doing, we're talking to each other, I can ask you to clarify and you get a much better representation of what somebody is saying. So when you try to teach people in English, because I knew see you share some stuff in English and you say some stuff in your native tongue and stuff like that, do you ever feel like you're you get anxiety by trying to say the right thing and not get the wrong information out there, like translating it?
Yeah, so it's a lot of time, because I know English, and I try to write it the best way I can, but I knew that there are certain expression that makes sound strange. But I say obviously, for right now, English is the universal language, and
Right.
there are a lot of people that criticize me, why you're speaking about Mexican English, and I said honestly, I throw to the stone in the internet, and I can find like 7 or 10 pages about subjects speaking of the things I speak in Spanish. And I said, I need to make the jump in with English, because a lot of the information and some of my friends are English speakers. So I said, no,
Mhm.
I need to express this kind of information, because a lot of people are speaking about subjects they doesn't understand, because they
Right.
doesn't live here. And I say, no, I need to make my grain of salt in this kind of discussions, because in some point we are living a misinformation area, and newly a dehumanization thing against certain groups of people.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Let me ask you, what is this right here? Tell me what this represents.
Well. Yeah, this is from a guy I encountered. He really is an indigenous person from the Tinec people. And one of the things you need to understand about some indigenous communities, obviously in the more specific rural areas, they tend to worship this kind of statues. This, as I tell you, this kind of statues, they represent a generic variety of deities called the Antigua, so the Lord ones, the loss of the earth, and obviously because of the loss of the memory, the representation of these figures lost the original meaning. But for the communities, they represent a connection with their past. So when these pieces are recovered, they tend to be worshipped as ancestors who can ask you favors. And not really
Mhm.
in the community, depends in the community, you can find that some communities tend to collect these figurines as relics and they preserve it and take care of them because it's the connection with their past. And one of the things that happens between the Mexican anthropologists and the communities is when these anthropologists came to take these statues to their study, the communities doesn't allow them to take them because they feel and they are robbing their ancestors. For example, there is some kind of controversy with the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City because it has a lot of figures, a lot of images extracted from all the content of these communities, and the communities say they rob us and they hide in ¿cómo se? Wait me, because I lost the meanings of these words. In Weiner, bueno, no. The, in cellars, they tend to they tend to collect these status in warehouse. They collect this in
Mhm.
this warehouse, and they doesn't see the light again. They let some kind of inventory. We have the statue. It's not so pretty because you can sell them to the foreigners, so we need to keep them in the warehouses to study. And the communities lost its its ancestors and their connections with their past. And obviously, it's an it's a conflict that the communities have because they want to control their past, their legacy, their archaeological areas. And obviously, this guy represents that. As you can see, it's in a main square of a town, and obviously, it's a decorative figure. But for this guy, this figure represents one of the lords of the air, and he's going to pay his respects to one of the forces that control the things that matters in their communities.
Right, right. I see it says L right there, EL, and I know that in some texts L means a god, EL means a god. So that's very interesting because it seems like that that goes from one side of the world to the other. So that's very interesting to me. Um and you said this is right in the middle of of basically in a city like. So what is he actually holding in his hand? That what does that represent?
Well, in Mexico, there is an incense burner. It's in the Nahuatl term is Popochcomet. It's a
Mhm,
very you can see it with the danzantes with the danzas
mhm.
aztecas. They use as the incense burners. This one they
Right.
use it to purify. They use it to
Mhm.
purify it with copal. It's a certain kind of resin, very aromatic, and they use it to clean the area from bad energies and spirits, obviously. But usually it's a purification incense. It's,
Okay,
it's
something
very
like sage then.
exactly.
Okay, okay. To cleanse the evil and so on and so forth, or the negative energy or what
Mhm.
sort. And that's see, and that's why I say there's a lot of similarities throughout our world. And is there some type of prayer or chant that goes with it?
Yeah, they have their own chants. Obviously, every community have their own chants, their own inns, their own entities they worship. Obviously, the Tinec have their own language. Obviously,
Mhm.
I cannot speak about the Tinec prayers because imagine they are like six, eight different language in Mexico. So
Mhm. Wow,
the-
6 to 8 different ones.
yeah, different,
Wow.
different one. So imagine each community has their own prayers, have their own beliefs. Obviously I speak mostly about the new people because are the ones I have direct contact because my mother grew in a new community and they knew about the things about these people even if she doesn't speak the language. But some relatives on my mother's side they speak Ñañú because they are doctors and they need to attend these communities, and obviously they need to speak the language to have a proper interaction with them. So
So that's something
it's a
actually I knew I learned.
yeah, it's a very dynamic situation that each area of Mexico have, because in some point you can find, for example, white descendant populations in rural areas that they share the same belief and the indigenous ones. So, and for me, the Mexican it's very complex in their mindset and in their ethnic background, because the I believe that the Mexican, in some point, they need to have a reconciliation between its past to recover in the indigenous background, because one of the funny things that happened, and really you can see this kind of meme that there was a white person that say I am Aztec, and the other one is more indigenous, say I am I am a Spanish descendant, and it's very true because you can find this kind of confrontation between the white white populations tend to be more pro indigenous, and the and the indigenous ones said no, we are more Spanish and everything. It's some kind of a messing mess.
That's pretty cool, man, because you could see how that's always around the whole world in so many different places. I got another picture for you. We've been going at it an hour, and hopefully, if you're willing, I would definitely love to have another conversation with you
Yeah.
because I'm definitely learning a lot. I think what you're doing is great, honestly, and the reason why is because there's some the reason why I brought up the ancient alien show and all this other stuff earlier on the ancient history show is because there's a lot of people that says, when they go to these places and they talk to the local people, they tend to sit here and basically say that these gods and so on and so forth came from outside of Earth's atmosphere and came here and so on and so forth. And listening to you talk and you saying, that there are certain myths out there that are not told to the just to anybody. You can't just go to Mexico and say, "Hey, tell me about your myths, your stories, your traditional oral stories, and so on and so forth." These people have to trust you in a certain way, and even if you gain their trust, they still won't tell you because whatever reason they have, for instance. But you have something right here that actually, when I first seen it for the first time, I thought it
Ah,
was pretty interesting because you say right here who were for the Catholic worldview was the devil, but for the inhabitants of, and I might butcher this, I apologize, Chicontepec, Tepec,
uh-huh.
he is the Lord.
Chicotepec.
Yeah, Chico. So I almost said it correctly. Yeah. So he is the Lord of the earth. So that's very interesting to me. Can you explain more on that, please?
Well, one of the things that happened when the Catholicism came in Mexico, they mixed the beliefs of the devil and the fallen angels with the indigenous gods, because in the theological debates they had in some point, the Catholic priests, they believed that the indigenous gods, they were fallen angels that they came and worshipped like gods. And one of the figures that appears mostly in indigenous myths is the figure of the devil. But the indigenous devil is not like the European one. The
Right.
Mexican devil is more some kind of an ambiguous entity that can bring order and can bring fortune and bring misfortune. And the people tend to please them to please I give you this offering, but leave me alone. I believe along the community. We make you this party for you, but please don't bring misfortune to us, because the indigenous deities, they tend to have a good side and a bad side. They bring fortune and misfortune, and obviously is one of the theological explanation about they have about the vision of the world, because they believe that, for example, Tacatecolot is the entity represented with the mask. It's an owl, and the owl was an animal who has a relation with sorcerers, and the sorcerers were one of the indigenous practice that survived the conquest. And obviously, Tlacatecolot was transformed in some kind of a devil figure, but at the same time, they associate the devil with the earth. And obviously, the indigenous people, they were agricultural people. They lived from farms, and they knew that they need to please Tlacatecolot. And obviously, it's very interesting because a lot of people doesn't know that there are different dates of celebration of the dead in Mexico. They believe, they only celebrate the dead in 2 November, and some people say, It's obviously it's a Catholic festival because they erased the indigenous trade. No, there are different dates that came back. In this community, they believe that the ones who commit suicide, they come back in January because Tlacatecolo, the devil, opened the earth to allow these souls to visit their dear ones.
Mm.
And this is from a certain community in Chiconotepe. Obviously, you can find that in September, the Archangel Gabriel is the one who opens the gates of heaven and bring the dead to work in the cornfields in September in preparation for 2 November. So it's a whole mindset. For example, if you want to know about the devil and witches in the colonial period, you can find this book. It's a very good one.
So, and I just want to make sure I understand it correctly. So the devil in this sense right here, is not necessarily evil or evil at all.
No, it has its own purpose in some kind of balance with God.
Okay.
It's an entity necessary for the continuation of the cosmos, and it's a indigenous, it's a pre-Hispanic mindset because they believe that the gods who are like in a Western view of evil, they have their own role in the cosmic order. And obviously, the
Oh.
devil has his own role in the cosmic order. He's the one who brings misfortune, but at the same time, is the one who keeps the community in check with the morality, with the. And he wants is the one who keep the riches from the people. And obviously, you need to make the offerings to the spirits correctly that allow to the devil to give his riches to the community. So it's a complex entity. It's a complex entity, and obviously, it's not an entity that the people want to encounter, but it's necessary
Oh
to the
no.
balance of the community.
So without this God, there's no balance, or without this devil, I should say, because that's what the
Exactly.
representation was of it. Okay, so see, and that's why I love learning about different things, because when I think of Christianity or the Holy Bible, um, God couldn't do what He did without the help of the devil, in a sense. And I say that because in the idea that there's a balance between there has to be a balance in between good and evil, right? You can't have good without evil, and vice versa, in the Christianity sense, basically. And or I should say, monotheistic religion, Abrahamic faith sense. And this is one of the things that I wanted to say earlier when we was talking about sacrifices. One of the you know recognized sacrifices in the Holy Bible is the one with Abraham wanting to sacrifice his son for God. And then it wasn't until an angel came later to say, don't do it. It wasn't God that said, don't do it. It was an angel to come and say. So the balance between that, uh, I can see how it interprets in different areas. I really got to say I really enjoyed what you shared. I mean, I wrote a lot of stuff down. I took some notes. Like I said, I hope to have you on more often, and you can share as much as you can, because this is very interesting to me. There's a lot of history in the Americas that we don't know about because of the simple fact that people are so interested in Egypt or Gobekli Tepe, or the even South Africa, or South Africa, West Africa, and stuff like that. Asia, Japan. People will follow that, but you don't hear too much about the Mexican myths, in a sense. Only when people want to say, "Hey, we have those type of myths here in the Americas," so they'll like to include the Mexican myths in America. So um, like I said, I really do appreciate it. You have been wonderful. I think your X account is very, very intriguing, very interesting. I think it's, to me personally, I highly recommend anybody that's watching, that will be watching this. You got to go to Mexican Myths and Folklore. It's at ABBASI Juan, Huan. He says, I'm just an ordinary Mexican who wants to share his knowledge about supernatural Mexico. For all the good people on Twitter, I hope not to disappoint you. You did not disappoint me. I'm very honored to have you share
Thank
what you
you.
said. And
Thank
I
you.
would definitely go through this more often and see. Matter of fact, just because I'm here, I'm definitely going to turn turn on all the notifications that you put out, because every time you share something, I definitely want to learn about. You have 7,799 followers, so you definitely have a great following out there, and you definitely take the time to share what you said. I mean, I've been running through it a lot in the last few days, just to get some ideas. I mean, you have some interesting stuff in here that I want to pick your brain as much as possible with what
Yeah.
you have. So, like I said, I'm honored to have you here. Is there any last words you would like to say?
Honestly, if the people want to follow me, you can even support me in my Patreon. I have some interesting publication about. I want to give more life to my Patreon, so I want to publish more often a certain very specific stuff that I didn't speak in this space, but there is a lot of very interesting stuff I want to share with pictures and everything. But I
I'm definitely going to join your Patreon after this. This is your Patreon account,
yeah, yeah,
Mexican Myths and Folklore.
yeah.
Is so. Tell me about, before we end this. Tell me about this background here, because this is back. This is very
It's the
beautiful.
mountain of it's the mountain of my city, the Shinantecal. This is the
Oh.
it's extinct volcano, but this volcano have a very deep religious belief system in the community surrounding the area because they go to the to this mountain to this volcano, and in the crater of this volcano there are two lagoons, and
Mhm.
the lake of the sun and the lake of the moon, and they tend
Mhm.
to give offerings to this lake to ask favor from the spirits of the mountain for the fertility of the land. It's and there is some kind of priesthood, indigenous priesthoods who survived the conquest, who are known as the Teotlaski or Saudinos, and they are the Tlaloc priesthood. They are the rain god priesthood that survive, and they make these offerings in this mountain to ask favor for the communities, for asking for a good harvest. So, and obviously, I like this mountain.
It's a very beautiful picture. I really do appreciate it. Like I said, well worth the information. I'm definitely going to reach out to you and talk to you again. I'm gonna go ahead and end it out in the.
Got a little hype now, can I let it die down? I remember days in the trench. Time to go hard in, time to go all in, time to get my all to this shit. Panamera maxed out, first class flights out Atlantic to Pacific, yeah, it's lit.